to me, my X-Men.
One thing about the X-Men that has been confirmed time and time again by Stan Lee himself in several interviews and panels is that these characters were essentially born out of laziness.
You are the father of mutants in the Marvel Universe. I mean, but
yeah, and that was done out of laziness.
After the success of books like The Fantastic Four and The Amazing Spider-Man, Stan Lee's publisher Martin Goodman wanted him to debut a new title. Stan wanted to create another group like the Fantastic Four, but had trouble figuring out how he would go about giving each character their powers without being repetitive and copying any origins he had previously written. The Fantastic Four had already been exposed to cosmic rays, Bruce Banner was bombarded by gamma radiation, which turned him into the Hulk, and Peter Parker was bitten by a radioactive spider before becoming Spider-Man. Doing any one of these things too much would get old fast. But luckily, inspiration eventually struck, and Stan came up with the genius idea of having his characters be mutants who were simply born with their powers.
If I say that my heroes are mutants, and they were just born that way, I don't have to explain anything.
But was Lee's intent from the very beginning to have the story of the X-Men stand as an allegory for the civil rights movement or the racial climate of the 1960s in general? This question is a little bit difficult to answer because there is evidence that kind of supports this being the case and not. Hey, I'm James.
Go fuck yourself.
This is Mixed Up Media, and we're going to be getting to the bottom of this somewhat frequently debated topic. Let's start by going over some of the responses Stan Lee gave over the years when answering the question himself. During a 2014 interview with the Rolling Stone, Stan was asked if the civil rights metaphor for the X-Men was something that came along in the first few issues of the series. He responded by saying, "It came along the minute I thought of the X-Men and Professor X. I realized that I had that metaphor, which was great. It was given to me as a gift, because it made the stories more than just a good guy fighting a bad guy." During an interview with Guardian in 2000, Stan was asked how he came up with the idea of the X-Men, and after explaining the origin for the idea of the characters, he goes on to say, "Then it occurred to me that instead of them just being heroes that everybody admired, what if I made other people fear and suspect and actually hate them because they were different? I loved that idea. It not only made them different, but it was a good metaphor for what was happening with the civil rights movement in the country at the time." And here he is saying virtually the same thing during the extras for the DVD release of X-Men: The Legend of Wolverine.
Then I thought it might be fun to get an analogy with the way some people are picked on by bigots and are persecuted by bigots. I thought, what if the human race is afraid of them, hates them perhaps, and prosecutes them?
And again, during a panel at Fandom Fest in Louisville, Kentucky back in 2013.
The whole underlying principle of the X-Men was to try to be an anti-bigotry story.
Unfortunately, we're not all going to agree on this because this is in the superhero comic book section of YouTube, but bigotry is, not cool. And Stan Lee even spoke out against racism several times throughout his career, whether that be through his work or in direct statements like this one from 1968, where he calls bigotry and racism some of the deadliest social ills plaguing the world at the time. We've heard from one of the co-creators of the X-Men themselves that the minute they came up with the idea for the characters, they intended to give their story a message that was anti-prejudice. But if the work was to speak for itself, it would paint a slightly different picture. Let's dive into the comics and you'll see what I mean. The X-Men begin as a group of 4 middle to upper class white teenagers who attend the world's most exclusive boarding school ran by this bald menace, Professor Charles Xavier. He has 4 students who he basically turns into child soldiers. Scott Summers, aka Cyclops, the Angel, who has an insanely fancy name, Warren Worthington III. Iceman, aka Bobby Drake, who is spinning around an ice pole that he made for some reason, and Hank McCoy, also known as the Beast, who is not the blue furry that we know him as just yet. A few pages into the story, they are joined by one singular red-headed woman, Jean Grey, who is given the name Marvel Girl. Together, led by Professor X, they are the X-Men. A group of mutant teenagers whose mission is to defend humanity from the evil mutants. A handful of panels later, we're introduced to Magneto, a mutant supremacist who wants to overthrow humanity and rule the world. His very first act of terrorism is just trolling NASA so hard that they fail a rocket test. Then he gets a little more serious and takes over a military facility so he has somewhere to launch his mutant rebellion. The X-Men hear of this and act quickly, jumping into their custom-made Rolls-Royce. Then they fly to the incident on their private jet. They fight Magneto, they defeat Magneto, then the military sings their praises. So, where exactly does this comic speak about bigotry? When discussing why he put the team together, Professor X briefly tells the story of how when he got his powers as a kid, the people around him grew to fear and distrust him. Because of this, he hides the fact that he is a mutant, explaining that he feels like humanity isn't ready to learn that another species of people live among them. This is about as far as the anti-bigotry message goes for a while. As we saw earlier, Stan said one of the leading ideas for the X-Men was to have a team of heroes who were hated by the people they protected for simply being born different. However, mutant hate and mutant fear aren't really common issues in Stan Lee's run. Not even as evil mutants like Magneto, the Vanisher, or the Blob continuously terrorize the world while announcing how inferior they believe humanity is to mutant kind. In issue 2, the X-Men are famous. They're working alongside the government, and the Angel even has fans who interrupt them during a mission to get his autograph. The next time we see any mention of anti-mutant bigotry is in issue 4, when Magneto discusses saving the Scarlet Witch from the people of her town who wanted to get rid of her because they were afraid of her powers. But they don't even know she's a mutant, and just like with Charles' childhood experience, it's glossed over and only discussed for about one panel. In issue 5, the Toad disguises himself as an athlete competing in a track meet. He's dominating every single event, so the spectators think he's cheating, and they go after him because they're angry. The X-Men believe that everyone is mad because they feel inferior, so they help him, not knowing that he's one of their enemies in disguise. I know this seems like a decent amount of examples that we've covered so far, but they're obviously surface level. And aside from this, up until issue 14, the idea of humans hating mutants is just something Magneto repeats to his minions to convince them to help him take over the world. But in issue 14, Among Us Stalk the Sentinels, Stan's alleged intended message is brought front and center. It's here that we're introduced to Dr. Trask, the man who is largely responsible for starting the mutant panic. Because of his warning that mutants are dangerous and hiding in plain sight just waiting for the right time to strike and overthrow humanity, the headlines are printed in the newspapers warning families of this mutant menace. Dramatizations of how allowing mutants to live freely among them in society would lead to human enslavement were created. The media begins fear-mongering and convincing their viewer and readerships that this group of people were conspiring against them, that they were a threat to their safety. In response to this, humans grow intolerant and rageful, and start throwing around funny little words like mutie.
You're a mutie!
Trask creates Sentinels to exterminate the mutants, but he inevitably loses control, and the X-Men fight to stop them, causing him to realize that he misjudged them due to his own fear of their powers. This storyline lasts for 3 issues before the X-Men return to their standard adventures, and mutant hate isn't really brought up again for the remainder of Stan Lee's run on the Uncanny X-Men, which ends with issue 19. Stan Lee said that when it came to the underlying anti-bigotry message of the X-Men, his plan was not to beat the readers over the head with it and make it so obvious.
Social issues I try to get in the background or underlaying a plot, but never to the point of letting it interfere with the story or hitting the reader over the head.
It was right there from the beginning, but it wasn't exactly the main focus. Noticeable, but still not as synonymous with the title as it became in the 80s and the 90s. However, the idea of mutants facing discrimination for simply existing as they were came along before even the X-Men. In the Amazing Adult Fantasy issue 14, released the year before the X-Men in 1962, Stan wrote a story about a kid named Tad Carter who got bullied for his mutant powers. So when we look back at the handful of statements we got from Stan Lee himself, it's pretty obvious that he did plan on using the X-Men to teach young readers about the harmful nature of bigotry from the start. Was it flawlessly executed? I'll leave that for you to decide. But I will dispute the idea that the X-Men were originally inspired by the Civil Rights Movement. There was no anti-mutant legislation that made it legal to discriminate against them. There were no mutant rights organizations or organized protests anywhere in Stan Lee's run. The X-Men was really just about 5 teenagers fighting evil mutants, while occasionally being made aware of how different they were from humans. The civil rights movement was way deeper than this. It certainly wasn't about Martin Luther King assembling a group of black teens, then going off to defend white America from Malcolm X and his Brotherhood of Evil Minorities. I hate to break this to some of you, but these two did not influence the creation of Professor X or Magneto, at least the earliest iterations of these characters. In the same Rolling Stone interview I cited earlier, Stan is asked if he made a conscious decision to have Professor X be like MLK and Magneto be like Malcolm X. He responds by saying, "I think it was certainly an unconscious feeling, yeah, and I never felt Magneto was 100% bad. I mean, there were reasons why he felt that way, but it was up to Professor X to find some way to make him understand." I think this is an example of Stan just telling people what they wanted to hear, and there's no real harm done. This is a decent answer to the question, but there's barely any comparison to be made between his versions of the characters and these two civil rights leaders. During Stan Lee's run, Professor X and Magneto were flat. One was good, one was evil, they were not complicated at all, and they certainly didn't have any prior history that tied them together. When people do compare these two to MLK and Malcolm X, a lot of the time they will be hung up on the idea that since MLK and Malcolm X had two different ideologies when it came to civil rights, that meant one of them was good and the other was inherently bad, and this wasn't the case. Professor X says that mutants should be able to live among humans freely without fear of harm or persecution. Yes, MLK believed that minority groups should be able to live comfortably alongside the majority as well, but this was their only similarity. MLK was not organizing protests for the sake of protecting the people that largely hated him. In fact, his protests were meant to make Americans uncomfortable enough to push them into action. MLK was also committed to nonviolence, which is something Charles doesn't really have as an option considering the fact that the X-Men face so many different threats all the time. Now let's talk about Magneto. Lee's statement about him not being all bad is something that he said numerous times.
And I had Magneto as the head of the evil mutants, although I kind of like Magneto. He's not that evil. There's a reason that he's the way he is.
But if you've read his run on the X-Men, you would know this was not true. Magneto's only purpose was to oppose the X-Men, and he was as standard and cartoonish as any other average supervillain back then. He had a secret lair on an asteroid, and a car shaped like a magnet. Not to mention the fact that he named his faction of mutants the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. Nowadays, we all know Magneto as being a multi-layered, sometimes redeemed man who is also a Holocaust survivor and an old friend of Professor X. Back when the character was first created, he was just evil, and he didn't even have an origin. He was loyal only to himself and just wanted to rule the world. He was willing to kill innocent humans and even sacrifice the mutants he recruited to his cause, all for the sake of reaching his goal. Malcolm X might have been falsely painted as a villain in the media during his day, but he didn't want to destroy all of the white people in America, contrary to what the FBI might have wanted the country to think at the time. His belief was that white and black people should live in separate but equal societies, not that he should be the ruler of them all. So where did we get the idea that MLK and Malcolm X played a major role in inspiring these two characters? The fact of the matter is, even though Stan Lee and Jack Kirby created the X-Men to have this underlying anti-bigotry message, the works of other creatives on the X-Men years later are the reason why many of us see them as an allegory for the civil rights movement and some specific leaders within it.
Your Honor, my client is charged with a simple felony. You're denying him bail just because he's a mutant.
This begins with British comic book writer Chris Claremont, who took over the Uncanny X-Men in 1975 and had a legendary 16-year run on the title. During what is described by many as the golden age of the X-Men, Claremont introduced many of the most popular characters and storylines that the mutants have gotten to this day. It's largely due to him that the mutant metaphor for oppression exists. He's quoted for saying, "The X-Men are hated, feared, and despised collectively by humanity for no other reason than that they are mutants. So, what we have here, intended or not, is a book about racism, bigotry, and prejudice." Unlike with Stan Lee's run, the message is so in your face and so obviously inspired by historical events and the social climate at the time that I don't see how you could miss it. He really leans into the metaphors with his time on the X-Men. Going back to Magneto, it was Claremont who gave him his origin as an old friend of Professor X, who also lived through the Holocaust. The Days of Future Past was informed by Claremont's experience as a Jewish man working in Israel with Holocaust survivors. This experience led him to writing a story about mutants being hunted and mercilessly killed by the Sentinels for just existing. What he called his definitive work with the X-Men in a Reddit AMA, God Loves, Man Kills, is about the dangers of bigotry and religious extremism. Claremont cites MLK's I Have a Dream speech as being part of the inspiration for the story, and he admits that his Professor X begins to show shades of MLK and Nelson Mandela. In God Loves, Charles is a man with a dream of a peaceful mutant-human coexistence that is trampled over by a harsh reality. He also co-created the island of Genosha, which you probably know is the site of the most recent mutant genocide in 1988, and used it as a grounds to base stories that acted as allegories for slavery and South African apartheid. The island was even purposefully placed on the southeastern coast of Africa to further solidify this connection. There have been so many other metaphors like these made in comics by other writers over the years. The Friends of Humanity is a pro-human mutant hate group that was inspired by real-life groups like the KKK and neo-Nazis.
Why do you hate us? What did we ever do to you?
You were born.
The legacy virus, which was originally only harmful to mutants, is commonly seen as an allegory for HIV and AIDS, which disproportionately affected people in the LGBT community, as well as other minority groups. It doesn't even stop at just the comics. The original animated series doesn't shy away from discussing the dangers of mutant hate, and they cover many of the storylines I've already mentioned.
Get rid of the mutants. It's the only way to stop the plague. Send them back to where they came from.
This trend would go on to be carried over into the live-action film franchise in the early 2000s as well. The director of 2/3 of the X-Men film trilogy, Bryan Singer, said that his movies were influenced by his experience as a gay or bisexual man. In X-Men United, the scene where Iceman tells his family that he's a mutant is intentionally written in a way that makes it seem like Bobby is coming out to his family.
Bobby, have you tried not being a mutant?
Singer is also part of the reason why people make the connection between MLK and Malcolm X, and Professor X and Magneto. Charles preaches the idea of wanting a peaceful coexistence between mutants and humans, while at the end of X-Men 1, Magneto quotes what has become known as Malcolm X's by any means necessary speech.
And bring about the freedom of these people by any means necessary.
The war is still coming, Charles, and I intend to fight it. By any means necessary.
Even though I think these movies are fun, they're also a little bit unserious when it comes to committing to the whole civil rights analogy.
Raven, I asked you a question.
I don't answer to my slave name.
And Beast, never forget. Mutant and proud.
So to answer the question in the many forms it takes, have the X-Men always been political? Have the X-Men always been woke? Has the X-Men always spoken about bigotry and racism? The answer is yes and no. Were they created specifically because Stan Lee wanted to write a comic book to teach tolerance to kids? No. But he said numerous times that the minute he created the team and made them mutants who were born with their powers, that he intended their stories to have an underlying anti-bigotry message. It may not have been completely obvious in his run, but it has been there since the very first issue of the X-Men. So there's the answer, even though I personally don't think it matters all that much, because even if that wasn't Lee's intention from the start, whether you like it or not, the X-Men have become a really popular metaphor for how pretty much any oppressed group you can think of endures injustice at the hands of their oppressors. And it sucks to say this, but decades later, many of their stories that were created to mirror the harsh experiences of the oppressed remain extremely relevant. Thanks for watching. Peace.